So you know I'm paid in full.
Hey, what's going on? It's another episode of the Teel podcast, and like always, I have another great guest, Mr. Greg Nakashian. How you doing, man?
Not bad. How you doing?
I'm doing good.
Cool.
I'm trying to be like some of my other podcast idols and get some learning happening on this channel.
Well, you invited me. I don't know how well that's going to work, but sure, we'll try.
So, all right. So history, that's your area, right?
That's what I do.
And you say that your most specific study is in medieval times, right?
Yeah, medieval.
Can you give us like a brief overview of how you got into like medieval stuff or just history in general?
Yeah, sure. That's fine. So I was always interested in history growing up. I'm from Massachusetts originally. And for me at the time, it was mostly, Civil War history. I was really into that and World War II and stuff. The medieval was actually not until I got to college. Long story that we won't get into. But before going to college, my stepfather set me up with a professor over at Western New England University in Springfield and said, hey, he's a history professor. You're interested in history. Why don't you chat with him? And I went over and went into his office. And he was, he had a big bushy beard and was very genial. And his office was full of like maps. And I think he had like a shield leaning against the wall or something. And I'm like, what the hell? What is this? And he was an Anglo-Saxon historian. He was, a historian of England prior to 1000 for the most part. And we talked for quite a long time. He was very engaging. He was very interesting. And he was telling me about this kind of world that I knew nothing about. I knew nothing about medieval history, really, when I was, 17 or 18 at that time. And so I kind of thought, maybe I want to do some medieval stuff. And then my freshman year, that spring, I took a course with him, which was an upper division course on Europe in the first millennium. And I think the way he taught it had something to do with why I became a medievalist. It was, it was very engaging, and it was very much about making the student be a historian. So a lot of times when you teach history, or I should say when people teach history, when history is taught, we'll use the passive voice to protect people. It's usually taught as kind of memorizing a bunch of names and dates and facts, and then taking an exam where you're expected to remember and dissemble them correctly. Yeah. And I hate that. And he did not ever do that.
That's how my school experience was, definitely, for sure.
That's how almost everybody's is. Yeah, it's awful.
I like learning history from podcasts specifically because it's just like I learned more from the conversation angle of it. So that makes a lot of sense what you're saying, yeah.
So he would give us basically primary source material. And this was, at this point in the class, it was Roman history. And I remember he gave us, the Life of Augustus by Suetonius, or the Satyricon by Petronius. And he would have us write essays about it before we talked about it in class. And it was like, tell me about what anxieties did Roman elite society have based on the writings of Petronius? And I'm like,
so you had to go learn it, but he didn't teach it to you till afterwards, right?
Right. Well, he didn't teach you the actual document you were looking at. So you would talk about the sort of the general nature of, say, Rome in the first century AD. And then he would give you this, it's actually a play that Petronius wrote. And he'd say, show me what you can do with this. And I remember thinking, like, I'm not a Roman historian. What the hell are you talking about? Like, what am I supposed to say? And he's like, well, I don't know. You read the document and tell me what you think it's saying. And I thought, I feel like I should know more. He's like, well, you should. But analyzing things is what a historian does. And then putting it into the context is what you're going to do as well. But I want to see if you can analyze it. I want to see what you can do with the material. And it was liberating. I mean, it was the first time I had ever actually realized that being a historian was more than just being able to, list the order of battle of Gettysburg or something,
right? Which
I can still do. But that's not being a historian. That's being somebody who's good on Jeopardy or something, And
right, like you were saying before we started, that it can turn into like a bunch of just trivia facts.
And knowing stuff is important. Like you have to know things that happened in order to be a historian. But that's like, you have to know more to be a surgeon than just where the bones are. It's like there are other things that go into it. And he was the first one who really at college. But I had also had some really good high school teachers who had fostered my love of history. I thankfully escaped from high school. I think the year before standardized testing became a thing. I graduated in 1996, and I think Massachusetts implemented the standardized tests in 97.
Did you have a football coach for history?
No, that's not quite as common up there. My history teachers were people with degrees in history who had gotten into teaching to do history.
Every high school history teacher I had was a football coach.
That's probably not wrong. And some of them,
and some of them were great.
Some of them can be great.
Yeah,
I mean, I've had students, less so now at A&M because when we created the kinesiology degree, we had more students who wanted to be coaches kind of move to that one. But prior to that, a lot of them would study history for that very reason, because they're like, well, that's probably what I'm going to end up having to teach when I'm coaching.
Right.
And some of my best students over the years were folks who primarily wanted to coach, but also would end up teaching, and they were great. And so it can work, but it's a lot. I mean, for a state that worships football the way this one does, why don't you just have full-time coaches?
Yeah.
I don't get it. Like just
that is interesting.
Pay the offensive coordinator be a full-time coach. You could leave him out of the classroom.
You could tell like the difference in the class that week, like when a major football game was going to happen. It was like, all right, y'all copy this down. No, I mean, he's got bigger things on his plate than.
Well, because they're being hired to be the wide receivers coach. They're not being hired to teach ninth grade social studies or something. And so that does kind of stink. And they have to work hard to overcome that. And it's not really fair to the coaches or to the students. But hey, I get it. That's the nature of the world, and what have you.
So medieval times, let's zone in on that. In fact, for some reason, I just had this thought. When my kids, when we were little, and my parents used to take us to a place called Medieval Times.
Oh, yeah. Love it. Window into the past.
Was that historic? Was that like a historically accurate place? I know that was not something I planned to ask you. That was just...
I know I've not been to the one in Dallas, so I need to be clear about that. I'm going to go out on a limb and say probably not. Yeah, I mean, I was introduced to that sort of place actually in Las Vegas at the Excalibur Hotel and Casino. They have a dinner show that is very much like medieval times, and there's horses and scripted sword fights. And not generally, no. I mean, there were horses and they did have sword fights and so forth, but not, that's very sort of 19th, 20th century theatrical kind of our imagining of what the pageantry of the Middle Ages was. Now, they did have pageantry and they loved it, especially as the period went on. You would get tournaments that were more like shows than the earlier tournaments. Like the tournaments in the 12th century were basically just battles that kind of had rules, like if you break your arm, go sit under that tree and we won't kill you, that sort of thing. By like the 14th century and the 15th century, they were a little bit more.
But that's
theatrical.
Fighting in front of crowds. Was there large crowds? And
you would get that later on. Yeah, in the early days, I guess if there happened to be people in the neighborhood that were hopefully not being run over, they might watch. But like I said, the 12th century tournaments were more almost like just quasi battles. Basically. And so the church hated them. They outlawed them all the time because they were destructive and they would run over peasants and steal livestock, and people would die all the time. By the 14th, 15th century, they were more...
was it like a shadow of like the gladiators? Is that kind of what they were aiming for? Or
that's an interesting question. I mean, I think it springs in some... so gladiators were more... Those were for public sort of public consumption, right? You'd put them into the arena, the amphitheater, and it was to entertain the populace and reinforce the power of the Roman state. That we can have our prisoners do this for your amusement, that sort of thing. Whereas like tournaments were more about the knights; they were more about the guys fighting. The gladiators, they were more about the audience. Whereas for the tournaments, the reason you went to a tournament if you were a knight was to demonstrate your prowess against your fellows, right? You wanted to be able to show that you were the fastest, the strongest, the best, whatever. And you could make money at it. There's a great, there's great examples throughout the Middle Ages of knights kind of making their living by being good at tournaments.
Wow. And when you say Middle Ages and medieval, is this the same thing? Yeah. And that, can you give me the exact time or the ballpark?
Sure. Well, that depends. That's a complicated question. The old sort of traditional view of the Middle Ages or medieval Europe, if you take it at its broadest, is about 1,000 years from 500 to 1500 AD. But like anything, that's, we're just kind of creating that. Generally speaking, we've divided that up into maybe the early Middle Ages, which will be like 500 or 600 till about 1000-ish. And it depends on the area you're talking about. There's very different Middle Ages for places like Spain versus England, which is where I study. And then like 1000 to 1350 or 1400 might be kind of the high Middle Ages, or maybe 1300, and then you might have the later Middle Ages. But it just we've constructed that imagery of time to fit our view of kind of the progression of civilizations and stuff. And a lot of that comes out of the Renaissance, because like the Renaissance created itself out of the idea that it was not that which came before. It was kind of hearkening back to the classical period. So when you're crafting your narrative as the Greeks and the Romans were really, really advanced and we're really advanced, but everybody between us wasn't, that's why you literally call that period the Middle Ages.
Okay,
right?
so
the middle between those two poles. Yeah. It's not true, and it's not fair.
Were they really that far behind as far as like you compare it to like the Romans?
Yeah. No, not really. Yeah. I mean, it depends again on what we're talking about, right? The reason why I think the folks in the Renaissance and we ourselves kind of look back on the Romans, especially as being this kind of highlight of civilization, is because on the surface, they resemble more of what we care about. A lot of them lived in cities. A lot of them sort of had jobs. They were citizens, they voted, that sort of thing. Whereas in the medieval period, most of these folks were living in villages. They were farmers. And, it seems like it's a regression.
Was it just kings? Like in England, was this a time that there was kings in England?
Yeah, you'd have kings. You'd have a king in England going all the way back to that's another question. Yeah, but it's 800 or so with Alfred, somebody like that.
That was the first king?
Well, no, there were kings before him, but he was one of the first that was kind of king over all of England, because England itself
split into a couple parts.
It had a bunch of different kingdoms.
Right.
So when the Roman province of Britannia sort of stopped being Roman, more or less in the 5th century, you had a series of folks from Germanic areas kind of move in. You had the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, some people coming over from Frisia and so forth. They set up a series of different kingdoms. And at the time, kings were generally speaking over groups of people. They weren't over like places necessarily. So they were like the kings of the Angles or the kings of the Mercians or the kings of the Northumbrians or what have you. And then where they settled, you would eventually start kind of building like borders. But it was all very messy, because they were fighting with each other all the time.
And what time period are you describing right here?
That would be like the 600s.
600s, okay.
Yeah, into the 700s.
Okay, yeah.
And then over time, actually, the Vikings showed up in the late 700s, and they largely started beating the crap out of the Anglo-Saxons, the native. Have
you watched
kingdoms.
The TV show Vikings? I have. Okay,
yeah, I haven't watched all of it, not like Star Trek, but I've watched some of it.
Right. Okay, so at the end, when they go over there, and then there was 4 different sections of England. Is that right, or did they just make that up on the show?
It's a simplification, but it's not. Right. It's not totally a fabrication. There were different. Yeah, there were like different kingdoms of the English that, and they they wouldn't even necessarily have called themselves the English. They would have been like the Northumbrians or the East Anglians or the Wessex, which was the main one that sort of survived.
Yeah, that's the one. He was that. I guess the main character. Sorry if I'm ruining. But anyways, Ragnar or whatever. His main beef was with the king of
Wessex.
Wessex,
because Wessex is the one that the Vikings never conquered.
Right.
They conquered all the other kingdoms. And so when, in a lot of ways, the Vikings kind of helped the unification of England out in the sense that because they had largely defeated all of the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, when the kingdom of Wessex started pushing back against the Vikings and reconquering for the first time these other parts of England that they had never controlled, but they drove the Vikings out, they didn't go looking for the other royal lines.
Yeah,
they didn't go say, oh, hey, we've liberated Mercia. Let's go find the Mercian king. They just said, Wessex is bigger now.
Yeah,
and this is all sense. Wessex. And so by the time, you get to Alfred and his sons, they're the ones who, when they largely drive the Vikings out, you get one kingdom of England by the Yeah, by the 900s or so.
900s is the first.
The first kind of unified kingdom. Wow. I mean, there were kings prior to that. Offa of Mercia had claimed to be king of all England and so forth. So like anything with history, my students will tell you, the answer is almost always, well, that's complicated and it depends.
Right. Yeah.
Basically, the basic answer is always that. Yeah.
You're giving me your opinion based off what you've learned, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And as another thing I tell my students, like my advisor told me, your opinion plus, rationally interpreted historical evidence, that becomes a historical argument. And that's good.
Yeah.
So when I ask them to write essays and they struggle with just not writing reports of things.
Right.
And they're like, oh, you want my opinion? I'm like, well, I do, but I want your opinion grounded in the historical evidence. And once you do that, then it's a historical argument.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And the thing you have to get past is that you're probably wrong. Or others can disagree with you with the same evidence rationally.
Right.
And that's okay. Like there are things where two people can look at the same piece of historical evidence and come to very different interpretations.
Oh, yeah, there's two people that can look at a piece of the news today and come
right, and that's
we can't even interpret what's happening right now. So history must be
history is the same.
Way more complicated.
Yeah.
Hey, if you're enjoying this podcast and you're watching on YouTube, if you could take just a few seconds to go hit that subscribe button, it really does help. That'll help notify you when we drop new videos. And we need all the subscribers we can get so we can keep bringing you content every week. Now back to the show.
And that's one of the things I think that people don't realize about history, that we like to think that history is black and white because it happened.
Right.
That's true, but misleading.
What do you think about this? The people say history is wrote by the winners. Is that?
I understand why. That's a very old kind of expression. In the old days, that was probably true to some extent, in the sense that if I was the Babylonians or the Assyrians and I destroyed your city, then your city was not going to be writing a history of my conquest. I was going to, because you were dead.
True.
These days, I don't think it's true. And in fact, I would say one of the best examples of that would be the history of the United States Civil War. Was for a long time primarily written by folks from the South. And kind of from that perspective, right? Mm-hmm. That helps shape our view of the war, because it was largely being written by folks who came from the losing side of it. Okay, and again, I'm not a Civil War historian, so that about taxes my understanding of historiography. Right. But yeah, so in that regard, and Civil Wars are a little bit different because, they are by nature the same country. But no, I'd say that these days, plenty of losing sides of wars will write histories, and that's okay.
But maybe further back, though, like you said, if someone got eliminated.
Yeah, right. Back in the old days, if you were the Romans and you eradicated the kingdom over there and set up a Roman colony and a Roman province, then yeah, they weren't going to be writing a history of their kingdom because they were gone. But those days are somewhat over.
See, I know this is not your area of expertise. I'm sorry, I go all over this, because this is just where how my mind works. But I've listened to a lot of history on, like, let's say Cortez coming over, and there's a lot of debate about, this may be controversial, hell, but he's them making up things because they got to be the ones that relayed back to what Cortez came from Spain, I believe, about what he found over there.
Sure.
And so, I mean, there is a chance that he just made a good bit of what
he probably did. Yeah, and you're right. It's not my area, but I would never let ignorance get in the way of crafting an answer for myself. But from what I understand, like some of the stuff that I think was exaggerated about Cortez were things like the Aztecs and others greeting the Spanish as though they were gods, right? I believe that we now look at that and we think, yeah, there's no actual evidence that they looked at Cortez as this whatever god it was meant to be, whoever it was. I can't remember the woman's name, but she wrote a really, really interesting article about this a few years ago that I read. That story comes much later from, I think, a Dominican or Jesuit friar or somebody like that, who basically kind of just said it. Yeah. We don't have any other evidence for it. And we're like, yeah, I mean, there's no real reason why they would have looked at them as gods, but sure, fine. And so, yeah, there's plenty of stuff like that in history that there's a lot of things we kind of take for granted that we were taught or that come to us, especially if there's only one document that talks about it or two documents or whatnot. And you have to kind of trust it So one example from the area that I study, I do a bit of work on like the legends of King Arthur, right? He's, big figure.
And that is just a legend. Well, that's probably debated, right?
It depends. I mean, I go back and forth every time I teach it. I think to myself, like, yeah, I don't know.
He could have been a real
Could have been
dude.
real, probably not. But, for a long time I thought, no, probably not. But if Arthur were real, then he probably lived somewhere in the late 400s, early 500s, something like that. The Romans are gone, but we don't have the records that we get later on from the Anglo-Saxons yet. And what's annoying to the point is there's one writer that we have from England or from Britain at the time. He was a monk named Gildas, who we think is writing in about the 540s about the kind of the collapse of Roman Britain. And he never says Arthur. He never mentions Arthur, but he says a few of the other things that become part of the Arthur legend. But what's annoying about it is he's the only one. Like, there's literally one guy whose writings survive from this entire province, basically, for, 80 years or whatever. And even if everything he's saying he believes is true,
It could be wrong.
It could be wrong.
Yeah.
And it's incomplete. And, you'll see this with like documents all the time. You'll read these kind of monastic chroniclers from wherever all over the kingdom in England who are just writing year by year things that happened. And, 1 year it'll be 3 paragraphs on this invasion by the Vikings. The next year there was a drought. The next year, nothing happened.
Nothing.
Yeah, the next year. And it's just like, I feel like something probably happened that year, man. But you are at the mercy of your sources. And you just have to hope that they contain the stuff you're interested in. So
I think when people look back at like our time that we're in right now, it'll be the opposite problem.
That is, yes, 100% true.
There'll be too much information.
My colleagues who study more modern history, especially folks who study like 20th century history, when you run into mass literacy and you have, even just if you're studying, say, the 1930s, right? We'll pick them. You've got hundreds of thousands of pages of just newspapers from just the United States, leaving aside all of the magazines, periodicals, books, articles, radio shows, government documents, of which there are millions of pages. And that's just the written sources and the oral ones. Whereas, like, as a medieval historian, there's a lot. If you study England.
Yeah, so what was the record keeping like for that? Is it a lot of one dude from the town had a deal in that?
It depends. So I study mostly England, and mostly England from, like I said, about 1000 to 1300. So in that period, you'd have chroniclers.
Were they So were they writing?
Yeah, they'd be in a monastery usually, writing down kind of either annals. So like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, it's called, it's like a year by year sort of thing. And some of the years a lot of stuff happened. And some of the years, nothing happened, apparently. Some of them will write histories where it's a little bit more intentional. There was a monk named Orderic Vitalis. He wrote the ecclesiastical history of England, where he tells basically the history of the church in England for hundreds of pages. So you'll have stuff like that. But not a huge number of them. You will have some government-ish documents in the sense that you'll have some surviving charters. You'll have some surviving writs, which are like just orders. You'd have things like Domesday Book, which is a survey of the kingdom in 1086, which is not complete, unfortunately, but is very useful. You'd have literature. So you'd have some imaginative literature that you could use. Things like Beowulf, for instance, that's much older. Or the Battle of Malden, which is from around about the year 1000. And other
Beowulf, is that old?
Beowulf's even older, yeah. Beowulf, I think the first written version of Beowulf is, I want to say 9th century. I think that's right. I could be wrong. But I think it comes from Wessex, though we're pretty sure there were some earlier versions from Mercia and Northumbria. The tale itself goes back probably to Scandinavia, I would assume. But it's written for the first time in England. But if you go with France as well, you'd get the romances and the epic poems and such coming out of northern France. And so there's plenty of that. But even all of that together, you could put into, one part of a library. And it's everything.
Yeah,
it's
everything.
Everything you need is there. And it's crazy. Like that that there is a lot, but it's infinitesimal compared to what historians of the future are going to have.
Yeah,
like
2024 is going to be wild to try to
in 500 years, people trying to study this period will have, I thankfully by then they will have very advanced AI to comb through all of it. Because when I jokingly say history is anything anyone's ever done ever anywhere, that's true. But what's different is now we record all of it.
Yeah.
Like what we're doing right now. Like they will have this.
Yeah, they'll have.
And they'll be like, so what did people in 2024 think about history? Well, we have this podcast from Joseph Teel. And it'll be like, and someone will probably write a doctoral dissertation about this in 500 years. So there you go.
That would be cool. Hey,
yeah, so we'll be immortalized.
I finally made it. Just 500 years too late.
Yeah, fair. So it's like, being a historian is a lot of discerning, what is good evidence and where to find it and how to look at it and all that. But modern historians have a very different struggle than I do.
One thing I think about when I think about like the Middle Ages, I just can't imagine not walking around with like no ID. You don't have none of these new things like a social security number, nothing. It's kind of like you were just out there.
You were out there, and you were your own agent in a lot of ways. Yeah, and that's an interesting feeling, I suppose. At the upper levels of society, there was a solidity of identity at any level. Everybody, you knew who you were. You had a name and so forth. But the landscape of your experiences and your interactions were pretty minor in the sense, or much more limited in the sense that, like, if you were a farmer from Yorkshire in northern England, the limits of the world that you were going to travel in were reckoned in, probably within 100 miles of your village.
Right.
Is really about the limit, depending on whether you ended up getting, drafted into the army or something, or if you went on crusade or something, they might be a lot longer. But for the most part, the people in your village knew you. Yeah. And if you went to another village, they'd say, "Who are you?" And you'd say, I'm Johan from Little Driffield. And they'd say, "Okay, there you are.
How are you?"
Yeah, right. Well, good to meet you.
Wow, that is wild.
But yeah, you're right. They didn't have to
we're like
prove it.
Tagged and tracked and
very different, very different. You start to see more of that at the noble level with things like coats of arms or crests or heraldry, that sort of thing, where you wanted people to associate what you were doing on the battlefield or at court with who you were, right?
With the battlefield, is that how you would go from being a farmer to somebody of significance, like as far as up on the rankings? Okay, so you feel like you're a farmer.
Yeah.
How do you end up in like a...
How do you end up as a knight?
Yeah. Or something of that nature.
Well, the short answer is you don't, right?
Okay.
Generally speaking,
so
you
it's
don't.
Just you're born into that.
The Middle Ages, at least in Europe, Western Europe, there was not a lot of social mobility. You could. There were ways to rise up. I guess the most dramatic way would be, let's say you were at the Battle of Cressy or something in the 100 Years' War, and you deflect an arrow that was heading for the Black Prince's heart or something, and out of thanks, he knights you as a baron or something. Sure, I guess that's possible. And,
right.
It may probably happened a couple of times. But generally speaking, the way that you would raise your family's lot in life was, at least in England, you could do it through expanding your family's holdings. As the sort of land tenure system started to change a little bit by the middle and later part of the Middle Ages, there were ways that peasant families could kind of take over parts of other families who had maybe died out or sold them or something. And then if you were able to build up your holding enough that you got wealthier, you could move into a position of authority within the village, and then eventually kind of move into the yeomanry and so forth. And I guess build that up to being a country gentleman by the early modern period. That's possible, sure.
But it's mainly like a genealogy.
You mostly are going to be what you are until that style of life goes away. So, like, if I were to, if I were to do my genealogy, my family comes from Ireland and the islands of Italy and Sicily and Armenia for the most part. I would be surprised if I found anyone in any of those areas that was doing much more than growing food of some kind, right? Like, that's probably what they were doing. The Armenians, maybe doing something else. Nakash in Turkish means like embroiderer or calligrapher or something like that. So it's possible my family had some connection to more urban activities in what is now the Middle East. But, generally speaking, they were probably farmers. Most of our heritage, all of our heritages, were farmers.
Right?
Like that's what
we had to feed everybody.
90% of the world did for thousands of years.
They
was they
appreciated farmers more than we do now.
Well, it's funny. Maybe I don't know because everybody did it.
Right, so you're just a regular dude.
Everyone, one of the things we talk about. I teach a course on futurism, and one of the things we talk about is that one of the biggest shifts you get in human experience is the Industrial Revolution. This shift where prior to 1800. The vast majority of people everywhere in the world for all time earned their livelihood by farming, subsistence farming primarily. And then by 1900, huge portions of the world are living in cities, working in factories or working in shops, whereas now by 2000, 2024, the percentage of full-time farmers in the United States is what, 3% or something?
Really
it's tiny. It's tiny. And we produce enough food to sink a battleship, as they used to say, right? And so it's like that inversion is still incredibly recent. I mean, we're talking 200 years.
Yeah, which is small,
which is nothing.
History. Yeah,
and you could argue if you want to take a long view of history that we're still working our ways through that. Like we're as a society globally, we're still trying to figure out what do you do with people when they're not farming? What are we meant to be doing with our days? So I don't know. It's something interesting to think about.
This podcast is brought to you by Teel's Septic Service. Teel's, yes, that's right. It's in my name. It's our family business, and it's been family owned and operated since the 1950s. Do a little math. That's 70 years we've been taking care of this area. So for your septic needs, call 903-794-4732. Now back to the show. I think this is probably left field. I think we're going to have to figure out what we're going to do when stuff does stuff for us.
That's I was just watching the second episode of the most recent and sadly last season of Star Trek Lower Decks last night with my daughter.
Oh, I love Lower Decks.
So good.
I watched it all.
It's so good. And the episode yesterday or last week when they go to the planet that has just now joined the Federation and has moved beyond capitalism because they have replicators and they call it like the post-scarcity economy. And everyone's like, yeah, what the heck do we do now, right? We don't have to work anymore because we can just make whatever you want out of matter. And that is an interesting question. One of the episodes of the original Star Trek I use in my futurism series is called The Ultimate Computer, about where it was 1968 and they're kind of test driving AI flying the Enterprise. It doesn't go well. But, Kirk is sort of struggling with that of like, am I afraid of losing my job to a machine? And one of the things that Dr. McCoy says to him is, yeah, we all feel bad when mechanization takes the other guy's job, but it's different when it's yours.
Yeah.
And it's true, right? Like we don't know what happens if we all get replaced. We've seen it throughout history.
I think it's happened before though,
sure.
right?
Absolutely.
There's been giant shifts of new technology or something that put the original way of life just completely changed. And they probably all were on the doomsday thoughts that we think of AI, but then we just adapted and we did new things.
I was thinking there's a deeply, when I used to teach World Civ 2, I used to use this. There's a deeply mediocre film with a wonderful ending called Other People's Money with Gregory Peck and Danny DeVito. And anyway, the climax of the film is what's going to happen to this wire and cable company. It's like 1991 or so, post-industrialism, what's happening, we're obsolete. And one of the things that Danny DeVito, who plays the villain, of course, who's a venture capitalist, says about why the company should be sold off because it's obsolete, is he's like, there was probably a time when there were dozens of companies making buggy whips, and I bet the last company around made the best expletive buggy whip you ever saw.
Yeah.
But how would you like to be an investor in that company? He's like, it's dead.
Yeah.
So these shifts do happen. The difference, or if you're like bred horses or something, like if you bred horses until 1940, I assume there was a much bigger demand for them. And
right. That's how you got around.
What do you do after that? It's like, society shifts, society adapts. But that process of adaptation is incredibly disruptive and destructive for the people going through it, right? So, and that's hard. I mean, I think
we're going to live through that.
I thought we're definitely living through it.
because it's happening now.
Yeah.
Like we got used to technology, and then we kind of like, I guess I say mastered it. I don't think we've mastered it, but we made it to where our life was like super easy, and then it started helping our jobs. And I think what we're seeing is it's slowly saying, oh, it's becoming less of a tool and more of like, it could just do it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, you're right. That like, and again, I hate to keep referencing this course that I teach on futurism, but one of the things that they started worrying about, really starting in the mid 1800s, was what's going to happen to humanity when mechanization makes everything too easy. And so a lot of the stuff that we study in the course, there's a wonderful short story by E.M. Forster from 1909 called "The Machine Stops," and it's imagining a society where people are now living underground, and there's this machine that just does everything for them, and they're all a bunch of lazy slugs, and they don't like seeing people anymore, and it's stuff like that. Jules Verne's worrying about it in Paris in the 20th century, and H.G. Wells is worrying about it in The Time Machine, that we're going to make life too easy. And we're going to lose that struggle that makes us humans, that sort of thing.
It's like Wall-E or something.
Right, exactly. Yeah, Wall-E is the modern example of what they were worrying about in the early 1900s as they saw this world becoming mechanized. That like, what do you mean? You don't have to churn your own butter anymore. What kind of weakling are you going to be? That sort of thing. Yeah. And it's like, I think we'll be okay, but it may be a painful process of getting on the other side. Yeah, hopefully it doesn't go like Wall-E. I don't know, that'd be a problem.
I think we're in for it.
Yeah, maybe.
I definitely think there's going to be a learning curve. But humans over time, have, like we said, we've always been able to. It hurts, but we've always just go to whatever the next step is until we create something maybe too powerful. Maybe like.
Well, I talk to my students about this. That like, because one of the big things that students worry about is what to study. And I always tell them, the best thing that you can do is study something that gives you a firm foundation of knowledge and skills that will serve you for the rest of your life. Because you are probably not going to be doing the same career for 50 years, right? You're probably not. Some people do, but it's rare. Like you want to have the ability to kind of do different things. And so studying that which kind of speaks to you, that gives you that capacity to engage and develop skills in reasoning and thinking and knowing stuff and all the rest, that's the most important thing. And, there are other ways of doing it, of course. But because you're right, you're going to have to weather the travails of whatever changes in society. Like there's some things that we're pretty confident are going to still be around for a good long time, But others,
have you seen the robots? The Elon's robots.
It's interesting stuff.
Yeah.
No, it's true.
Did they not watch the movie?
That's right. Have you not let me show you this movie called Terminator?
Yeah, Terminator. Robot.
Yeah, just because
I always talk about the Avengers one. The first one with Ultron.
Oh yeah.
Ultron woke up for 30 minutes and was like, "Yo, this place is awful. Y'all got to go."
Yeah, just because we can build it, maybe doesn't mean we should. Yeah, that's fair. Yeah.
I wonder. Throughout time, we've been, and the common person, there's been things that are out of the common person's control.
Okay.
Maybe things like obviously like nukes. Okay, like I don't want there to be nukes, but there are nukes. Yep. And maybe there's things like AI that's happening. Like, okay, I see where this is cool, but maybe like, let's not get too far into it maybe.
Right.
Because there could be consequences for that. But as the common person, we don't have no control over that.
Yeah.
Can you think of any examples of that same type of feeling, maybe older?
That's interesting. That's interesting. I'll have to think about that. I don't know, because like technology as a social mover is a little more recent at the mass scale. Right? Like the technology that you would have found in the ancient world or in the medieval world was more, if your village had a mill or something, that was useful, right? I don't know that you would have seen it as like, well, I don't want any more mills, right? But it wasn't personal. I mean, it was to the miller, I guess. That's why he made so much money. But the idea of like either individualized technology that's going to majorly shape your life, that's probably more of like an industrial revolution-ish thing and onward. or the general societal ones where it's going to affect the life for everybody in a very real sense, like, nuclear weaponry.
But maybe even just war, like getting dragged into something that you, like, because if you were in Rome, you probably weren't just chilling at some point. You were.
You might have had to fight eventually.
You might have had to fight somebody, or you know.
I mean, war back then was generally pretty personal in the sense that, like, you would see the person for the most part that you were fighting. You know, whether if you were fighting in short combat, you know, with a spear or with a sword or something, you would see them right there. You know, you might be shooting arrows or slings or catapults or whatnot, but you'd still see them. This is all mostly line of sight battles. So I think the experience of war was very direct. You know, it was very personal.
It's different than hitting somebody from across the globe.
Dropping a nuke on them. I mean, these days, I guess with drones, it's a little bit different because you do see them. You know, if you ever watch the videos coming out of Ukraine, for instance, that are horrific. Of watching drones literally fly into troop transports and such.
That's just a dude in a trailer with a Xbox controller, basically, almost. That is insane. That is so wild.
And the fact that, you know, it is crazy. So in that regard, in some ways, you're kind of bringing back the personal nature of war, but only on one side, on the side of the person doing the violence. But yeah, I don't know. That's an interesting question because, I don't know. I'd have to think about that. I don't know if there was a particular technological thing that would have shaped their experience, especially in war.
Were they fighting with boats yet? When did that happen?
Well, I mean, you know, they fought on boats pretty much as soon as they figured out how to float them. But actual like naval combat was, that'd be sort of, you'd get that in the ancient world. You'd get ships ramming each other and so forth, more or less. You would also get ships where you were essentially using them as platforms to shoot at each other with arrows and that sort of thing. The Romans, you know, when they fought the Carthaginians in the Second Punic War.
I listened to that on The Rest is History.
Okay,
the Romans versus the Carthaginians.
That's a fascinating war. The series of wars, the first and second Carthaginian wars.
They were like as strong as Rome.
Yeah, the Carthaginians were probably, I mean, prior to the Parthians and the Sasanians, they were probably the closest thing to a real match for the Romans. And it was mostly because of their naval capacity. Like they had a huge navy and they were really, really good at it. And I always remember that the Romans, when they fought the Carthaginians, I think in the first Punic War, they developed a system. They knew they couldn't really match them in terms of maneuverability with their ships. And so they would essentially just lodge their ships against them using a corvus, where they would just drop this spike on the ship to hold the ships together.
Right.
And then they would run across and kill the crew with swords. Yeah. I was like, that's a very Roman
let's
solution.
Fight now.
Yeah, let's do some actual fighting. Stop rowing. What is this crap? But yeah, I know the Greeks were big on naval war.
One of the sides stole the boat design, didn't they?
Oh, probably.
I believe the Romans
probably stole it from the Carthaginians.
And they came back with a redesigned
version of the trireme. Yeah. That wouldn't surprise me. The Romans, they were not known for being mariners for the most part. Rome is not on the coast. It's close, but it's not on the coast. And so, the Roman Navy was largely comprised of Confederate sort of cities, allied cities and stuff prior to this, from what I remember anyway. It's a bit before my time.
Right. Whew. All right, let's go back to your specific time.
Sure.
That's how far I can go.
No, it's fine, man. Whatever.
I'm having fun. You having fun?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's all that matters. So more wild questions for you.
I'll see if I can answer.
When I think of like medieval times, I start tying it to shows like Vikings or like Game of Thrones.
Oh, sure.
Or like Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, classic.
Which Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones are two of my favorite deals. And I love that they're so different because I love one for one reason and one for...
yeah, I've got a thought on that, but go on.
Oh, well, let's talk about it.
I mean, and this is not a thought original to me in the sense that this is people that study those two authors have sort of talked about how George R.R. Martin, I think, has said, I hope, that in a lot of ways he was writing Game of Thrones as kind of a response or rejoinder to Tolkien, right, to Lord of the Rings. And so what he meant by it, and I'm hoping that this is true because it makes sense, was that, Tolkien believed that people drove the efficacy of institutions. So like the reason why Gondor was failing was because they didn't have a king, right?
They had fail.
Right, there it is. So like and the same with the Rohirrim, right? Rohan was failing because
of
the king was under the sway of Wormtongue and the rest. And when he rediscovers his strength, Rohan returns. And when Aragorn is put on the throne of Gondor, Gondor returns, and it's a golden age. And so Tolkien is giving you this idea that like the people make the politics, the people make the policy. That you have a good king, good things are going to happen. And
I see where you're going with
right.
this.
And Martin is like, nah. I think if you put the good people put in good positions, terrible things will happen.
Right.
And you see that especially in the first book. Spoiler alert. With what happens to Ned Stark, he's setting you up to think that this is a very Tolkien-like telling, in that first book where, it looks like Ned Stark. He's going to
go to Westeros.
He's going to do the right thing. It's going to be fixed. Like good guys are going to win because they're doing the right thing. And the Janos is going to help them. And Littlefinger, who's the best character, is going to, and it all falls apart. Right. And the hero dies. And the kingdom dissolves into acrimony and civil war. And the bad people prosper and the good people suffer. And Martin does that intentionally to say that, no, sometimes you want, what's the elder Lannister's name?
Tywin.
Tywin, yeah. Sometimes you want a Tywin Lannister on the throne, pulling maybe you need him. Yeah. Frankly, you probably want Cersei on the throne. She was probably the best.
Yeah.
But
until the end.
Well, she goes a little nutty by the end, yeah. And so Martin, at least, has, I think, said publicly that he was writing Game of Thrones to kind of undermine that Tolkien-ish idea that, like, no, it takes more than the noble man on the throne. Sometimes putting the noble man on the throne is the worst thing you can do. You end up with bad things happening, which is an interesting, cynical kind of way of looking at the world. But anyway.
Game of Thrones it's wild. I
never watched the series religiously. I read all the books, at least until he gave up writing them. And not that I'm salty about this.
I read all the books, and I think that they are
14 years. Write the next one.
Yeah, it was 2 of them left.
No, we're waiting on 2. He's not. You better not die before you finish those books.
But he's already thinking of others because now he's got the TV shows and this.
I'm so disappointed.
I didn't like that they got off of because I watched the TV show first. Oh, okay. And then I read the books and I was like, this is different.
Yeah. My understanding is that the first season and the first book are very, very close. Yeah.
And then it just starts
going off.
By the later ones, they're like,
well, they're writing it themselves by then. Yeah. And like I said, I never watched the series. I watched bits of it here and there.
So you never watched the TV show?
No. Okay. I watched, like I said, I would look up parts of it on YouTube and stuff.
Yeah.
Just to kind of see how they did it. Because I was curious. Like, how do you do the fight between the Viper and the Mountain, for instance?
Oh my gosh.
Brutal. But it's also pretty brutal in the book, to be fair. It's very similar.
So let's bring that back to what you do.
Yeah, sure.
These portrayals of that, is that this type of time period that you study? Is that how accurate are we getting there? That's
a great question.
Maybe point out some positives, like this is kind of where it's hitting.
Okay. Yeah, one of the areas that I studied a bit was knighthood. And so like the study of knights, the study of warrior culture, that kind of thing. And I would say that where those are both pretty accurate was that prowess in battle, prowess with weapons, being a good fighter was foundational and the primary thing that a knight was meant to be known for. That if you weren't good with a sword, good with a spear, good on a horse, good with an axe, good with a mace, whatever, then you might have the other attributes of knighthood. And that might be okay, but if you weren't good at fighting, you were probably going to be dead, which is a problem. But that was like your primary thing. So like my PhD advisor, a guy named Richard Kuiper, wrote a series of books kind of talking about this. His most well-known was probably Chivalry and Violence in medieval Europe, where he talks about this, that like the ability to do violence was the main thing that a knight was supposed to be good at. So especially if you read like imaginative literature from the time, whether it's epics like the Song of Roland or the Song of Aspremont, or romances like Lancelot or Yvain or these others, the best knights are the ones who hit the hardest, cut horses in half with one swing of the sword. Not possible. But like that's what they're being lauded
Is that
for.
not possible?
It is not. No, okay. Swords, no. You couldn't cut a horse in half. Really disappointing. Wish you could. The mountain maybe could.
Yeah.
So, like, that's what they're lauding them for, is this ability to do violence.
Were they like superstars in, like, when you saw, were they treated like famous people or? They
could be, yeah, depending on where you were, so you were earning kind of on, almost everything a knight did was in this kind of honor shame culture that they lived in. So they lived in a world where they wanted to accrue honor, and they lived in a world where they were deeply afraid of shame. So,
same.
Yeah, right.
Same.
Yeah. No, in many ways, there's a certain kind of basic truism to it, right? That like their currency, I mean, they liked money, but their currency was honor. And so
who would pay them? The king would pay them to, or how would you make money as a knight?
That's a great question. Like everything, it's complicated,
right?
And it depends. If you were a landed knight, you would make money from your lands, from your barony or manors or whatever. You'd get income from that. If you were a landless knight, then you would either make money by being a retainer, so you could be recruited into the household of a duke or a king or something, and you would be a household knight. Sometimes, it'd be like a retainer, and you would basically be like his bodyguard, the core of his army, what have you. You could also make money on tournament, and you could make money in battles. So one of the best examples in medieval England is a knight named William Marshall. He was a knight who was born, we think, in the 1140s. He was the fourth son of a very minor noble named John Marshall. But he dies in 1219 as the regent of England. He's the regent of Henry III, and he dies like one of the, that's why we know about him, because he was a really, really well-known knight.
The regent would be
because the king was only 3 years old, so he was ruling the kingdom.
Okay.
Yeah, he was he was running the kingdom.
So he got the rule. In his place.
And so like his story, his son commissioned a biography of him later on, which was based, we think, on the recollections of his squire, a man named John. And so it's this really intimate, obviously fairly positive view of William Marshall. But one of the things that it talks about in the biography is that he really had nothing in life. I mean, in the sense that like in the scheme of noble, he didn't come from money. Right. His family money had already been given away to his brothers and stuff. And so the only thing he had was that his father got him a position as a squire in the household of William de Tankerville down in Normandy, because he was like a family friend. And that was really good, because that gave him a step into knightly society. But anyhow, he learns early on that when he goes into his first battle, he's like out there bravely defending the town or whatever he's supposed to be doing. And when he comes back to the feast that night, the other older knights are like, so, you had a great day. You defeated a bunch of enemies. Why don't you give us a gift out of all of that booty that you won? And William's like, what are you talking about? I did my duty and defended the town. And they all laugh at him. And they're like, no, you have to eat. Like, your first rule should be, when you defeat a guy, you take his stuff. You take his armor. You take his horse. Like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
And so anyway, I mean, again, it's probably an apocryphal story, but he does that. He goes out and he starts going on the tournament circuit and defeating knights. And actually, one of my favorite films about the Middle Ages, for multiple reasons, is A Knight's Tale with Heath Ledger. And that is a wonderful movie, because it's actually one of the most, I'm going to get crucified for this, it's probably one of the most accurate depictions of parts of aspects of the Middle Ages.
Right.
In the sense that it's a very fanciful telling of that story of William Marshall, of here's a guy who is kind of rising up from being very little to being very wealthy and very powerful and catching the eye. He eventually catches the eye of the Queen of England and gets into the royal household, and, his star is made. And it's because he is a great fighter in tournaments. And that's how he lives, is by knocking a guy off his horse and taking his horse and selling it. That's how
so
he lives.
They were jousting.
Yeah.
They were
or I mean, not as fanciful as you would see at something like medieval times, of course. A little bit more like just holding a spear under your arm and knocking a guy off a horse with it.
Right. I mean, they do those.
Yeah.
Well, you say you haven't seen the show, but on Game of Thrones, there's lots of jousting.
Yeah.
When I think of the tournaments, that's kind of what I think of. I mean, they just crash into each other.
Yeah. Later on in the Middle Ages, it became a lot more regulated like that, where you would have the lists, and you would have like the fence in the middle.
It took a little bit before there was like, Yeah, because that seemed like a sport almost. Like,
it almost
just happen to die if you mess up.
Which is a problem. Yeah, but like in the 12th century, no, it was just more. You'd be on a field and two guys would ride at each other with spears and try to impale each other for the most part.
It is what it is.
There it is. Yeah, there it is. So good stuff though.
All right, knights. So you said that they kind of could be treated differently.
Yeah,
they basically like could be hired out as private security for like a lord almost. Is that kind of what?
Some could. Yeah, you would have some who made their lives, not so much knights necessarily, but you would have some who made their living as mercenaries, as stipendiary knights or stipendiary soldiers or warriors, I suppose. Knighthood itself, as an institution, is very complicated. It sort of grows into an institution where it's more regulated by like the 13th century or so, and you get more like rituals associated with it of like making someone a knight. And probably in the 12th century, it was a little more loosey goosey. Yeah.
Do they have the first knight? Is there a first knight?
No, I don't think so. Not that we know of. I mean, because the word itself.
So somebody was.
Someone came first. Yeah, we don't know. But I think it just sort of emerged out of the warrior elite of Western Europe, because knight, the word knight is English. It's from Knecht, and it basically means like the servant, essentially. The word that you would use in other languages is a little bit different. So like in Latin, it's milites or miles, which means soldier. Whereas in the Romance languages, it's going to be some derivation of horse. So like chevalier in French or caballeros in Spanish, right? Both of those have to do with the horse. Even in German, ritter, rider. So like in Germany, France, and Spain, they connect a knight to the fact that you're a horseman, right? And actually even in Latin, in the Roman armies, the equites, the equus was horse. Whereas in English, they didn't really have knights until the coming of the Normans in the mid 1060s. They had knights, I guess. I don't know. They had thanes. But
the K was actually not silent.
That's one of the great things about Monty Python's Holy Grail is when the French guy says, "You silly English knights," because he's pronouncing it the way it would have been pronounced. It would have been CNIGHT. Knicht. It's a hard C. But yeah. So there you go.
What about kings? How did the king, okay, so we talked about it earlier, but once a king was like overall a king, and you said this was what, like 13? You said,
in England, you got sort of a single king, at least of the Anglo-Saxons, probably by the late 800s, early 900s.
Okay, so way early. Okay, so how did they rule? Were they kind to the people, or were they just an overlord?
It depends. How they ruled was, again, it depends. Yeah, it's hard.
I just think of these examples from like Game of Thrones, which is awful, but like, were they evil? Like
some of them were. Some of them, I'm sure, were rapacious. There's guys like Pedro the Cruel down in Castile. Bad King John in England. For the most part,
because I think there's so much unchecked power at a time where there isn't really checks and balances.
Right. Well, yes, the checks and the balances would be coming less from the peasantry. You're not going to get a lot of checks and balances from the peasants. Right. They'd be coming from the nobility, and they'd be coming from the church. So that's
we haven't got there yet. How big was the church involved in all that?
The church was intimately involved in most every aspect of life, but we have to be very careful. There was no the church. So one of the narratives of the Middle Ages, one of the things that they're trying to do during this time is they're trying to build sort of stronger, more coherent, centralized structures. Kings are trying to build kingdoms. They're trying to get, to this point where their power extends to all reaches of their realm rather than mostly just reaching to where they can reach to themselves, that sort of thing. And they have to trust their underlings elsewhere to do stuff. The church is doing the same thing. So like in the Middle Ages, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, is trying to build a unified kind of hierarchical top-down church where all the bishops look to the archbishops and all the archbishops look to the cardinals and all the cardinals look to him. And that never really was the case, except for maybe a very brief period of time in the early 13th century. There's too much autonomy. There's too much kind of independence in all of these institutions. Remember, we're at a time when the fastest way a message is ever going to get delivered is from horseback,
Right.
or maybe on ship. So like it takes weeks and weeks and weeks for messages to get from Rome to, York, to get to the Archbishop of York to tell him what to do. It's not going to work. So like royal institutions, papal institutions, all of them have a huge amount of local and regional autonomy built into them. So one of the narratives of the Middle Ages is kings, trying to build systems that are more like what we're used to.
Hey, if you're enjoying this podcast and you're watching on YouTube, if you could take just a few seconds to go hit that subscribe button, it really does help. That'll help notify you when we drop new videos. And we need all the subscribers we can get so we can keep bringing you content every week. Now back to the show.
Right. I talk to my students about this, that like we take for granted that federal authority extends to the furthest reach of Alaska the same as it does to Maryland. It's not stronger by Washington, D.C., and we ignore it out here. Well, we do sometimes ignore it here in Texas. That's a different thing. You know what I mean? Like we have legal authority, and that legal authority theoretically extends just as strongly anywhere in the country.
Right.
That's not the way it is in the Middle Ages, or really any time prior to the modern world where...
So what is it? The closer you are like nobility?
Yeah, the closer you are to the center of power, the stronger that power is. So you see this with kings, even up through the High Middle Ages, where they are literally itinerant, that they'll travel around the kingdom and kind of drop in at different parts of the kingdom and stay there with their retinue for like a month or whatever and conduct the business of the kingdom from there. Part of that is because it's hard to actually maintain a capital for various reasons. But part of it's also to kind of fly the flag. Hey, you haven't been out here in northern England for a while, so we're going to put the royal standard up here in York and remind you guys you're still part of our kingdom.
Yes, like when I keep going back to Game of Thrones. Sorry,
Sure.
That's like when Robert comes to Winterfell at the beginning. It's
it's kind of flying the flag.
Yeah, that's just...
Hey, you people up north, I'm still your king. Don't forget that. And so all of them are trying to do that. And they're doing it in other ways too. They're building government bureaucracies. They're building processes of... getting a phone call, but I'll do that later. Building processes of trying to do justice, so they're doing it through war. They're doing it through bringing justice to them. They're doing it through traveling around the kingdom. There's all sorts of different apparatuses that they're trying to use to build strong kind of royal power. And dukes are doing it. Counts are doing it. Everybody's doing it. Everybody's trying to build their own power up as much as they can.
You said capitals are hard to hold. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you don't see... I mean, some kingdoms will have de facto...
Is this pre-castles? Or
no, they have castles. The castles are... Well, they get them in France. They get them in Germany.
Okay, would those be like a capital? Would a capital be built around like where would the king be?
They could be. Yeah, it depended. So a king would usually be where his... he would be where he... I guess where the base of his power was, which might be a castle, might be like a fortified dwelling. That's certainly possible. And you'll see some areas where sort of like cities grow out of them. London, kinda. You see that with the building of the White Tower, the Tower of London by William I. That serves as kind of the core in some ways, though you had other elements of it that came from the old Roman Londinium and so forth. So you get that. Paris, kinda, I suppose. But generally speaking, a castle was the sort of solidified power center of either a king or a lord or a noble or what have you. Right. And they were very common in France. They were a response to the Viking invasions. And they become common in Germany. And they eventually become common in Spain. And they become common in England after the Normans get there. Prior to 1066, you don't really get that many castles in England for various reasons. And then the Normans show up and they start littering the countryside, as one of the Anglo-Saxon chroniclers says, with castles. They start building castles everywhere. Castles don't really extend royal power necessarily, unless they're royal castles, but they do solidify noble power. So, for instance, one of the problems that the King of France has when he's trying to build up his authority is that most of his nobles have castles, and that allows them to kind of ignore him.
Yeah, they could just say, no, we're not.
Yeah, we're not doing that. So, like, England is its own thing, but like France is a great example. In 1060, the King of France, when he dies, Henri the First, I think it is, when Philip the First takes over in 1060, the power of the King of France is really, really low. They really only control kind of the region from Paris to Orléans, which I think is about 60 miles. And that's it. All the rest of France is basically controlled by nobles.
Yeah.
Some of them big, like the Duke of Normandy, for instance, who's about to go off and conquer England, which makes it even worse for the King of France, or Duke of Aquitaine. Others are, small. They're just castellans. And the dukes are dealing with the same problem. Like, you can be Duke of Gascony, but if all of your nobles beneath you also have castles, well, they're going to not so much ignore you, because you can defeat any one of them probably, or even a few of them. But
if they team up,
well, that's the problem. And they are the ones who make up your army. So if you say to the nobles, hey, we're going to go beat up on this other noble over here, they might be like, awesome, I can't stand that guy. And if you say, yeah, because I don't think nobles should have this kind of autonomy, they might be like, whoa, boss, hey, wait a minute. I'm your friend.
Yeah, because you could be next. Yeah,
I could be next, right. And so, one of the things I used to use in my medieval history course was a great book. It's called The Deeds of Louis the Fat, Louis VI. He was the son of Philip I in France. And the abbot of the Abbey of Saint-Denis, a man by the name of Suger, wrote basically this book about his deeds. And if you read the early parts of it, when he's a young king, so much of what he's doing is he's going out, attacking castles held by his own nobles to force them to realize that he's in power. And these are not guys who are hundreds of miles away from Paris. These are like a day's ride from Paris or 2 days' ride from Paris. So he's like literally building the power of the King of France back up because his nobles, had gotten into the habit of, oh yeah, we'll listen to you when we want.
Right.
That sort of thing. And
That's
so
wild.
It could be very, very
I've never
difficult.
thought about it like this.
It's a great book. Yeah, Deeds of Louis the Fat. It's a little repetitive.
Was he fat?
He was by the end. Yeah, he did trend to the tubbyiness by the end. Yeah. That's what happens when you eat all those rich foods.
Do they know, were humans, like, their stature, were they built like us?
They would have been a bit shorter for the most part.
Okay.
Yeah, I think, and again, I'm not a I can't remember what they're called. I'm not one who studies. Right. Yeah, thanks. It sounded like it was plausible. There's an actual people who study these things, and it has to do with skeletons.
Because I remember somebody said that they would be shorter.
They're a bit shorter because of nutrition and such.
Skinnier, I imagine.
Yeah, they could be. Peasants, certainly. They had a diet that was a little bit healthier than ours, I think. But I'd have to go back and look at what like the average height was.
So Louis the Fat was living.
He was living large.
Yeah, different
literally
than everyone else. Yeah.
Yeah, he was the king.
I mean, imagine a time like you see like a larger person, and that would have been like.
Well, for a long time, that meant that they were wealthy.
Yeah.
I'm just telling my daughter to do something. Sorry.
Oh no! You're all right. Yeah, if you were a bigger fellow back in the day, you had it going on.
No, right. It meant you had money, you were wealthy, and that was true even up through the Gilded Age into the 20th century. That like being bigger meant you're a rich guy. No, exactly. Amen. You weren't out in the field 12 hours a day, planting and such.
When did Christianity become a part of because like in the Viking series, I think he's going back and forth. I think at some point between. Were they shifting? Yeah. In England, it became Christian during the Roman period. So, because Rome becomes Christian in by the end of the 300s. That extends to Britain as well. And then when the Angles and Saxons and others kind of invade, they're non-Christian, and so they largely are going to
drive Christianity out, I suppose, or or what have you. And then it's reintroduced to the Kingdom of Kent specifically in the 500s with the mission of Saint Augustine, not Saint Augustine of Hippo, different Saint Augustine. He comes back and I believe converts the King of Kent, Ethelbert, I think it was.
Ethelbert, that's the guy that they use from Vikings.
I think that's who the first Christian king was again. And then from there, it is going to spread and, probably re-Christianizes the islands by the, 700s or so? I don't remember when the last kingdoms really kind of converted.
For somewhere I thought I had learned maybe that there, at some point you could kind of go back, like this king decided that the country was going to be Christian, and then the next king may say, "No, we're Catholic." Is that a thing? Did that happen?
Well, prior to the Reformation, it would be the same. Christian was basically Christian.
So Christian was Catholic.
Yeah, they're the same thing. And so, more or less. I mean, the Greeks would argue.
Because of the Protestant Reformation, then it kind of becomes two different things.
Then you split between the Roman Church. Yeah, that'd be like early 1500s. So by the early 1500s, the Western Christianity, which just because it was all one denomination didn't mean that it was the same. Right. There was practices were very different in different places.
Martin Luther.
And then you get Martin Luther and the breaking off of the Lutheran churches, and then eventually the Calvinists, and then the Church of England shows up. And then you've got the Huguenots in France. But you've got the Roman Church still maintains its supremacy in Italy, in Spain, Poland for the most part. Bohemia wavers for a while and then comes back. And then France as well is largely Catholic. England kind of goes back and forth during the, Henry VIII splits off, but, he creates the Church of England, kinda. Like, he's very Catholic in how he sees things, except he wants to be the one in charge, not the Bishop of Rome. So the actual practice of the church is very Catholic. But then under his daughter, Mary Stuart, is that right? Mary Tudor, sorry. She's very Catholic and she just wants it to be Catholic again. But then her sister, Elizabeth I, is much more Protestant. So she pulls the Church of England over into the Protestant direction. And so, the 1500s in the church in England are pretty messy.
So it just goes back and forth.
It goes back and forth. Yeah, and it gets kind of solidified.
The Knights of the Templar deal, okay, that's in the Crusades, right? Those are those actually knights?
They were,
the way you describe knights, like the original knights, they are?
Kinda, yeah. The Templars are interesting. They were knights who had taken sort of like vows. They had taken vows that made them almost like permanent crusaders in some ways. So they were knights who had taken on basically holy vows to theoretically not get married, to not accrue property. So like the vows that a monk would take for the most part of poverty, chastity, obedience, that sort of thing. But they were knights. And so their primary function was to fight, but they were doing it theoretically at the direction of the Bishop of Rome and the church.
But they were theoretically knights. Okay.
Oh, they were knights. They were knights.
Yeah, I was just thought about knights, the Templar, all that.
They were knights that fought for holy causes.
But in the Middle Ages, there were lots of monks, right? Like when like on Vikings, they come over, they were easy targets, I'm guessing, right?
They were, yeah. Bless them. Yeah, the first places that the Vikings attacked when they went to England were monasteries for the most part, because they were usually out of the way, so they were trying to stay away from the world, and that made you were pretty far from rescue. People would keep precious things there. They would store things at the monastery for safekeeping or for just donating, right? Donating things to the monastery to further their work. And monks were not necessarily great at the fighting things. So, some of them would probably be okay. They're pretty strong guys and, Friar Tuck types, but they weren't soldiers. They weren't warriors, not really. And monasteries were seen as pretty good targets if you were a Viking.
That would be rough. You're just chilling one day in the monastery, hanging out.
Viking shows up.
Yeah, that's not a good day.
No, it's not. I love that.
I'm trying to think. If I have any more questions.
Sure.
And I've enjoyed this. We've been talking for probably about an hour and 20 minutes. That's probably good.
Okay. I got to probably run and get my son. He's at school. That's fine.
I'm gonna have you back on again.
Yeah, sure, man. Whenever.
I'm get my stuff together.
Okay.
Come up with some more questions. And get you, maybe to send me some more history people. That would be cool.
Okay. Yeah,
I'm down with that.
My colleague, Dr. Sykes, I think would be quite good for it as well. She runs our local regional history center.
So that would be history of this
area.
Oh, that would be awesome. I would love to do that.
She could do some cool stuff there.
I want to get a scientist.
Okay.
Like a science professor.
Sure. Any particular type of science you're looking for?
I do like astrophysics. I like the space stuff.
All right. Okay.
Or even physics.
No, I mean, I don't know much about physics aside from Star Trek. I'll have to think on that.
Yeah. If you got anybody, send them my way.
Okay. I appreciate it, man.
No, man, I definitely enjoyed this, man. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was cool.
For the channel, Joe Teel Podcast, like, share, subscribe, do all that. It helps me a lot. I'm on the hunt for more guests, so my email is on the YouTube description. If you think somebody would be good for the podcast, shoot me an email. And if you listen to us this long, we thank you. We thank you. Y'all have a blessed day.
Take care.
See y'all later.